I was sitting in the lawyer's office, surrounded by people who claimed to love the woman I'd spent 15 years caring for, when the oldest brother looked me straight in the eye and said, "You manipulated our mother." His words landed like stones thrown into still water, and I watched the ripples spread across the faces of the other siblings, each one nodding in agreement, each one suddenly convinced that I was the villain in a story they'd ignored until there was something to gain. What none of them knew was that their mother had anticipated this exact moment, and she'd left something behind that would make liars of them all. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 43 years old. I married into the Henderson family 17 years ago when I was 26, and my husband Michael was 28. Michael was the youngest of 4 children, the overlooked one, the son who stayed local while his siblings scattered to bigger cities and bigger lives. His mother, Ruth Henderson, was a widow of 12 years when I met her, a sharp-minded woman who ran her own small bookkeeping business from the converted garage behind the family home. The house was Ruth's pride, a 3-bedroom craftsman-style home built in 1952 that she and her late husband had bought when their children were young. It wasn't grand, but it was solid, with hardwood floors that creaked in familiar places and a kitchen window that looked out over a garden Ruth tended with the same meticulous care she applied to everything in her life. The house was worth a decent amount now, sitting in a neighborhood that had gentrified slowly over the decades. But to Ruth, it was never about the value. It was about the memories, the history, the life she'd built there. Michael's siblings were different in their own ways, but united in their distance. Thomas, the oldest at 52, lived in Seattle and worked in tech consulting. He visited maybe twice a year, usually around major holidays, and spent most of those visits on his phone dealing with work emergencies. Catherine, 49, lived in Phoenix with her third husband and called Ruth every few months, conversations that lasted exactly long enough to ease her guilt, but never long enough to be meaningful. David, 46, was the closest geographically, living just 2 hours away in Portland, but he was busy with his dental practice and his twin daughters' activities, always apologetic about how little he visited, but never actually visiting more. And then there was Michael, who'd stayed, who'd taken a job at the local credit union and built a modest but stable life, who'd married me, a girl from the same small town who worked as a teacher's aide and dreamed small, manageable dreams. Ruth had liked me immediately, I think, because I didn't try too hard or pretend to be something I wasn't. I was nervous meeting her that first time, but she'd made me coffee and told me stories about Michael as a boy, and by the end of that afternoon, I felt like I'd known her for years. When Michael and I got married, Ruth gave us the most generous gift she could. She let us live in her house. Not with her, she was careful about that, maintaining her independence. But when she was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease 3 years into our marriage, the arrangement shifted. The disease progressed slowly at first, manageable tremors and some stiffness, but Ruth was a pragmatist. She knew what was coming. "I don't want to end up in some facility," she told me one afternoon as we worked in her garden together. "I've seen what those places do to people. They're not living, they're just waiting to die." "You're not going anywhere," I said, though we both knew that wasn't a promise I could really make. "Sarah, I need to ask you something," she said, setting down her trowel and looking at me directly. "If things get bad, if I need help, real help, would you and Michael consider staying? Not just visiting, but being here? I'd pay you, of course. I have savings and the house is paid off. I just need to know I won't be alone. I didn't even have to think about it. Of course we'll stay. And you're not paying us. Your family." That conversation was 15 years ago. Michael and I moved into the house fully, taking over the upstairs while Ruth remained on the main floor in the master bedroom. The arrangement worked because we made it work. I adjusted my part-time teaching schedule to be home more. Michael took on extra shifts so we could manage financially, even though my income decreased. And we took care of Ruth. At first, it was small things. Making sure she took her medications on time. Doing the heavier gardening work she could no longer manage. Driving her to doctor's appointments. But over the years, as the Parkinson's progressed, the care became more intensive. I helped her bathe. I prepared special meals when swallowing became difficult. I sat with her during the bad nights when the tremors kept her awake and frightened. Michael helped too, but he worked full-time, so the bulk of the daily care fell to me, and I accepted that. I loved Ruth. She'd become more than a mother-in-law. She was my friend, my mentor, the mother figure I'd needed after losing my own mom to cancer when I was 21. During those 15 years, Michael's siblings visited sporadically. Thomas came for Thanksgiving every few years. Catherine sent cards and called on Ruth's birthday. David stopped by occasionally on his way to or from somewhere else, usually staying less than an hour. They all knew Ruth was declining. They all received regular updates from Michael about her condition. But they were busy with their lives, their careers, their own families, and somehow that was always enough of an excuse. Ruth noticed. She never said much, but I could see it in her face when another Christmas passed with only a phone call from Thomas. When Catherine canceled yet another planned visit. When David's promised weekend trip turned into a quick coffee stop on a Tuesday afternoon. She'd smile and say they were busy. That she understood, but I saw the disappointment. The quiet hurt of a mother whose children had moved on from her while she was still very much alive. I should have seen the warning signs of what was coming. Ruth started having conversations with her lawyer more frequently. She updated her will, she told me, to make sure everything was clear and fair. She talked about how grateful she was for Michael and me, how we'd given her dignity in her declining years, how she wished her other children understood what real family meant. But I never thought about the house, about inheritance, about any of it in mercenary terms. I just thought about getting Ruth through each day with as much comfort and grace as possible. Ruth died on a Tuesday morning in March, peacefully in her sleep. I found her when I brought in her morning medication and tea. She looked serene, like she'd simply decided it was time and let go. I sat with her for a long time before I called Michael at work, before I notified the hospice nurse, before I did any of the practical things death demands. I just sat and held her cooling hand and said goodbye to a woman who'd been the center of my world for 15 years. The funeral was well attended. Ruth had lived in the community for over 60 years, and people came to pay respects. Thomas, Catherine, and David all flew in, looking appropriately somber in their dark clothes, hugging me and Michael and thanking us for taking such good care of their mother. They seemed genuine in their grief, and I felt guilty for every uncharitable thought I'd had about their absence over the years. Grief makes people generous, I thought. They were remembering their mother, and that softened everything. The day after the funeral, Ruth's lawyer, Mr. Bernard Shaw, called and asked if all of Ruth's children could meet at his office that Thursday for the reading of the will. It felt very formal and old-fashioned, like something from a movie, but Mr. Shaw said Ruth had specifically requested it be done this way. We gathered in Mr. Shaw's office, a small space lined with law books and smelling faintly of old paper and coffee. Thomas sat with his arms crossed, clearly impatient to get back to Seattle. Catherine kept checking her phone. David seemed uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. Michael held my hand and I could feel his tension. He'd been executor of his mother's previous will and knew roughly how things were structured. But Ruth had made changes in the past year that she'd handled directly with Mr. Shaw. Mr. Shaw was a kind man in his 70s who'd known Ruth for decades. He put on his reading glasses and opened the document. This is the last will and testament of Ruth Ellen Henderson, executed 18 months ago and updated 6 months prior to her death, he began. He went through the preliminaries, small bequests to friends and charities, and then reached the primary assets, the bulk of my estate, including my home at 2847 Maple Street and all associated property. I leave to my son Michael Henderson and his wife Sarah Mitchell Henderson, in recognition of their devoted care and unwavering support during my final years. I leave to my other children, Thomas, Catherine, and David, the sum of $10,000 each, to be paid from my remaining liquid assets. The silence in that room was absolute. Then Thomas laughed, a harsh, disbelieving sound. "This is a joke," he said flatly. "Mother wouldn't do this." "I assure you she did," Mr. Shaw said calmly. Mrs. Henderson was of sound mind when she executed this will, and she made her reasoning very clear in conversations with me. "The house is worth at least $400,000, Catherine said, her voice rising. "And they get all of it while we get $10,000 each? That's not fair. That's not what Mother would have wanted." "Mother barely knew you anymore," Michael said quietly, and I squeezed his hand in warning. "This wasn't the time." "Because they kept her from us," David said, standing up. "This whole thing stinks of manipulation. Sarah was with her constantly, alone. Who knows what kind of pressure she put on Mom to change the will. I felt like I'd been slapped. I never pressured Ruth about anything." "You didn't have to," Thomas said coldly. "You isolated her from her family, made yourself indispensable, and convinced her to leave you everything. It's elder abuse, and we're going to challenge this will." The accusations started immediately and escalated quickly. Thomas hired a lawyer within days, an aggressive woman named Patricia Reeves who specialized in contesting wills. She filed a petition with the probate court claiming that Ruth had lacked mental capacity due to her Parkinson's disease, and that I had exercised undue influence over her to change the will in my favor. The petition included statements from all 3 siblings. Thomas claimed he'd called regularly and that I'd often told him Ruth was sleeping or not feeling up to talking, which he interpreted as me limiting his access to her. Catherine said I'd been unusually invested in Ruth's medical care and had made decisions without consulting the family. David claimed he'd wanted to move Ruth to a care facility where she'd have professional supervision, but that I'd argued against it and convinced Ruth to stay in the home, where I could control the situation. Every statement twisted the truth just enough to make me sound calculating and sinister. Yes, I'd sometimes told them Ruth was sleeping when they called, because she often was, and I didn't think she needed to be woken up for a 10-minute conversation that would just tire her out. Yes, I'd been deeply involved in her medical care because someone had to be, and none of them were volunteering. Yes, I'd advocated for Ruth staying in her home because that's what she wanted, what she'd asked for, what gave her dignity and comfort in her final years. But presented in court documents, with legal language and implications of malicious intent, it all sounded damning. Michael was furious and wanted to fight back immediately, but our lawyer, a patient man named George Hendricks, counseled restraint. "Let them make their case," he said. "The burden of proof is on them to show undue influence. We have Ruth's medical records showing she was mentally competent. We have testimony from her doctors. We have the will itself, which was properly executed and witnessed. Stay calm and let the process work." But staying calm was nearly impossible when the attacks became personal. Catherine started calling mutual friends and distant relatives, painting a picture of me as a gold digger who'd manipulated Ruth for years. Thomas gave an interview to a local news station about elder abuse, carefully not naming me directly, but including enough details that anyone who knew the situation would understand who he meant. David showed up at our door one evening, drunk and angry, demanding we do the right thing and split the inheritance equally. "You don't need that house," he shouted from the porch, while neighbors watched from their windows. "You're young. You can work. We have families to support, college funds to fill. Mom would have wanted us all taken care of equally." "Your mother wrote the will she wanted," Michael said, standing between David and me. "If she'd wanted equal distribution, she would have done that." "She was sick. She didn't know what she was doing. She had Parkinson's, not dementia. Her mind was sharp until the very end. Says you," David sneered. "Says the people who benefited from her confusion." The pressure of it all was suffocating. I couldn't go to the grocery store without feeling like people were staring at me, judging me. My coworkers at the school where I worked were kind but distant, unsure how to handle the awkwardness. Michael's relationship with his siblings, which had never been close but had at least been cordial, was completely shattered. And underneath all of it was a gnawing fear. What if they won? What if a judge decided that Ruth had been unduly influenced, that I had somehow coerced her? Michael and I had built our entire life around taking care of Ruth and living in that house. We had no savings to speak of because we'd poured everything into Ruth's care and our modest living expenses. If we lost the house, we'd have nothing. We'd have sacrificed 15 years for nothing. I started having nightmares about being evicted, about standing in that house Ruth had left us while strangers carried out the furniture we'd lived with for years. I'd wake up sweating, heart pounding, and Michael would hold me and tell me it would be okay. But I could hear the uncertainty in his voice too. 3 months into the legal battle, George called with news. They've subpoenaed Ruth's medical records and her communications with Mr. Shaw. They're also requesting depositions from Ruth's doctors, her home health aides, and several friends. They're building a timeline to show she was declining mentally and that you had increasing control over her affairs. "But her doctors all said she was mentally competent?" I protested. "They did. But Parkinson's can affect cognition in its late stages, and the other side is going to argue that Ruth was in decline and susceptible to manipulation. We'll counter with expert testimony, but these cases can go either way, depending on the judge. So we might lose." George hesitated. "It's possible. I won't lie to you, but we have a strong case. Ruth was very clear about her intentions, and we can demonstrate that." After I hung up, I went into the bedroom Ruth had used for so many years. It was empty now. The hospital bed removed, the medical equipment gone. I'd cleaned it and painted the walls a soft blue, unable to leave it as it had been, but also unable to repurpose it fully. I sat on the floor in the middle of the room and I cried for the first time since Ruth died. Not for her, though I missed her every day, but for the injustice of it all. I'd loved Ruth genuinely, cared for her without thought of reward. And now I was being painted as a manipulative opportunist by people who couldn't be bothered to visit their mother while she was alive, but showed up immediately when there was money to fight over. A week later, George called with news that changed everything. "Sarah, Mr. Shaw needs to see us immediately. He says he found something in Ruth's files, something she left with instructions that it only be revealed if the will was contested." We met at Mr. Shaw's office that afternoon. He looked tired, but also pleased in a grim sort of way. On his desk sat a small cardboard box. "Ruth brought this to me 8 months before she died," he said, gesturing to the box. "She said she'd been thinking about her legacy and wanted to make sure her wishes were understood. She asked me to seal this box and not open it unless her will was legally challenged by any of her children. If there was no challenge, she wanted it destroyed unopened." "What is it?" Michael asked. Mr. Shaw opened the box carefully. Inside were 3 USB drives, each labeled with a name: Thomas, Catherine, David. There was also a letter in Ruth's handwriting. "She recorded videos," Mr. Shaw said. "One for each of her older children. She told me they were her final words to them, explaining her decisions. She gave me very specific instructions that if they contested the will, these videos were to be shown to you first, and then submitted as evidence if you chose to use them. He handed us the letter. Ruth's handwriting was shaky but legible. My dear Sarah and Michael, if you're reading this, it means my other children have chosen to question my final wishes and, by extension, to question your integrity. I'm not surprised. I've watched them over these years, and I've seen what they value. It's not family. It's not love. It's comfort and money and the easy path. I've made these recordings so they will finally hear what I was too polite to say when I was alive. And so that anyone who doubts your goodness will understand exactly why I chose to leave you my home. Don't feel guilty about using these if you need them. I made this choice with a clear mind and a full heart. You earned every bit of what I've left you, not through manipulation, but through simple daily acts of love. With all my gratitude and affection, Mom, Ruth, I couldn't speak. Michael was crying silently, reading the letter over and over. Mr. Shaw gave us a moment, then said, "Would you like to watch the videos?" We did. He set up his laptop and inserted the first USB drive, labeled Thomas. Ruth appeared on screen, sitting in her favorite chair in the living room. The recording was dated 7 months before her death. She looked weak but alert, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. "Hello, Thomas," she said, and her voice was strong despite her physical frailty. "If you're watching this, it means you've decided to challenge my will, to claim that I didn't know what I was doing or that Sarah manipulated me. So I want to tell you directly why I made the choices I did. You're my oldest son, and I loved you from the moment you were born. But you left this family years ago, not physically when you moved to Seattle, but emotionally. You call maybe 6 times a year. You visit every 18 months if I'm lucky. The last time you came, you spent the entire visit on your phone talking about work. And you left after 2 days saying you had a meeting you couldn't miss. Do you know how many meetings Sarah missed to take me to doctor's appointments? How many nights Michael stayed up with me when I was frightened and couldn't sleep? How many times they rearranged their entire lives to make sure I was comfortable and safe? You're not a bad person, Thomas. You're just a busy person who forgot that your mother needed more than holiday phone calls and occasional visits. You forgot that family means being present, not just in the good times, but in the hard times too. I'm leaving the house to Sarah and Michael because they've been here. They've been my family when you chose not to be. And if you're watching this thinking, I'm being unfair or cruel, I want you to sit with that feeling. Because that's how I felt every time you said you were too busy to visit. Every time you cut our phone call short for a conference call. Every time you made me feel like an obligation rather than your mother. I love you. I always will. But love doesn't mean ignoring the truth. The video ended. We sat in silence for a moment, then Mr. Shaw inserted Catherine's USB drive. Her recording was similar. Ruth calmly and clearly outlining the years of distance, the canceled visits, the superficial phone calls. Ruth described a birthday when Catherine had promised to come, but canceled at the last minute because her husband wanted to go to a wine festival. She talked about inviting Catherine to visit several times and being told she was swamped with her new decorating business. You sent beautiful cards, Ruth said in the video with a sad smile. Your cards always had the prettiest pictures and the nicest sentiments. But cards aren't the same as presents, Catherine. Cards don't sit with you when you're scared. Cards don't help you get dressed when your hands won't cooperate. Sarah did those things. Michael did those things. That's why the house is theirs. David's recording was perhaps the most painful because he lived the closest. Ruth documented the excuses, the promises to visit that never materialized, the way he'd stop by for coffee on his way to somewhere else but never actually spent time with her. You had the least excuse of all, Ruth said to David on the recording. You were 2 hours away? Sarah and Michael sent you updates regularly. You knew I was declining, but you had your practice, your girls' soccer games, your new kitchen renovation. Always something more important than spending a Saturday with your mother. You're going to tell yourself I'm being harsh. You're going to say you were busy, you had obligations, you meant to visit more. But intentions don't matter, David. Actions do, and your actions showed me exactly where I ranked in your priorities. All 3 videos ended the same way. Ruth looked directly into the camera and said, I was of sound mind when I made these recordings, and I'm of sound mind now as I finalize my will. If you're watching this, stop fighting Sarah and Michael. They didn't manipulate me. They loved me, and they deserve the home we built together. Let them have it in peace. George immediately requested an emergency hearing to present the videos as evidence. This is extraordinary, he said, reviewing Ruth's letter again. Ruth anticipated exactly what would happen and created evidence to counter it. These videos show clear mental capacity, they demonstrate her reasoning, and they completely undermine the undue influence claim. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. During that time, George had the videos forensically authenticated, confirming they hadn't been edited or manipulated. He had Ruth's doctor at the time of the recording provide a sworn statement that she was mentally competent when the videos were made. He built an airtight case that these were Ruth's true, uncoerced final wishes. Meanwhile, Thomas, Catherine, and David had no idea what was coming. Their lawyer continued to build the case for undue influence, taking depositions from Ruth's home health aides, who all testified that I'd been kind and attentive, from neighbors who said the same, from Ruth's friends, who uniformly praised the care Michael and I had given. The evidence wasn't supporting their narrative, but they pushed forward anyway, confident that the sheer value of the house would motivate a settlement, even if they couldn't win outright. 3 days before the hearing, Patricia Reeves, their lawyer, called George with a settlement offer. They'd drop the contest if Michael and I agreed to sell the house and split the proceeds equally among all 4 siblings. We'd each get roughly $100,000. They'd walk away, and we could all move forward as a family. George relayed the offer. It's actually a decent settlement if you want to avoid the stress of a trial. You'd still walk away with significant money. No, I said immediately. Ruth left us that house for a reason. She wanted us to have it, to live in it. This isn't about money. It's about honoring her wishes, Michael agreed. We go to court. We show them the videos. We let Mom speak for herself. The day of the hearing was cold and rainy, appropriately miserable. We arrived at the courthouse early. Thomas, Catherine, and David came in together looking confident. They'd brought their families, spouses, and children, creating a visual display of the family they represented. It was calculated, I realized, a way to make Michael and me look like the outsiders, the ones breaking up the family unity. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Judge Marcia Thornton, called the hearing to order. Patricia Reeves presented her case first, arguing that Ruth had been in declining health, that her Parkinson's disease had affected her judgment, that I'd had constant access to her while keeping her other children at a distance, and that the will represented a drastic departure from her previously stated intentions to divide her estate equally. Then it was our turn. George stood and said, Your Honor, we'd like to present evidence that directly addresses the question of Mrs. Henderson's mental capacity and her reasoning for the distribution outlined in her will. He explained the existence of the videos, how Ruth had created them specifically in case her will was challenged, how she'd left them sealed with instructions. Judge Thornton agreed to view them in chambers first to determine admissibility. We all filed into her office, the space suddenly crowded and tense. Judge Thornton watched all 3 videos in full. I watched Thomas, Catherine, and David as their mother's words filled the room. Thomas went pale. Catherine started crying. David looked like he wanted to leave but couldn't. Their lawyer kept taking notes, but her expression grew increasingly troubled. When the videos ended, Judge Thornton was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "These videos will be admitted as evidence. They clearly demonstrate Mrs. Henderson's mental capacity at the time of their creation and her reasoning for her testamentary decisions. We'll reconvene in the courtroom." Back in the courtroom, Judge Thornton addressed everyone. "I've reviewed the video evidence presented by the respondents. In my 30 years on the bench, I've rarely seen such clear and compelling testimony from a decedent regarding their testamentary intent. Mrs. Henderson was obviously of sound mind. She clearly understood her assets and her family dynamics, and she made her reasoning explicit." She turned to Thomas, Catherine, and David. "Your mother left you a message. Did you hear it?" Catherine was crying openly. Thomas was staring at his hands. David looked angry, but defeated. "Your mother documented your absence from her life in her final years," Judge Thornton continued. "She didn't do this to be cruel. She did it to be honest. And she made a choice to leave her home to the two people who gave her care, dignity, and companionship when she needed it most." She paused, letting that sink in. "This court finds no evidence of undue influence. The will is valid as written. The contest is dismissed. Mrs. Henderson's estate will be distributed according to her clearly stated wishes." Patricia Reeves stood immediately. "Your Honor, we'd like to request—" "There's nothing to request, Counselor," Judge Thornton said firmly. "This case is closed. I'm also ordering that each contesting party pay their own legal fees and split the court costs. Mrs. Henderson's estate will not be depleted by a groundless challenge." It was over. Just like that, months of accusations and stress and fear ended with a judge's ruling. Michael grabbed my hand, and I felt the tension drain from both of us. As we filed out of the courtroom, Thomas stopped us in the hallway. Catherine and David stood behind him, and for a moment I thought there'd be another confrontation. But Thomas just looked at us, his face showing something I hadn't seen before. Shame. "I watched those videos," he said quietly. "I heard what Mom said, and she was right. About all of it. I wasn't there. None of us were. And I'm sorry that we put you through this, after everything you did for her." "You should have visited her," Michael said, and his voice was sad rather than angry. "You should have called more, been present. She missed you. All of you." "I know," Thomas said. "I'll have to live with that." Catherine stepped forward. "I'm sorry too. I was jealous, I think. Jealous that you had a relationship with Mom that I'd let slip away. And instead of admitting that, I tried to make it your fault." David said nothing, but he nodded, a small acknowledgement of his own failure. "Mom loved you all," I said, and I meant it. "She never stopped loving you. She just needed you to show up, and you didn't. But she still loved you." "She left us those videos," Catherine said through tears. "Even when she was dying, even knowing what we'd become, she left us messages. That's more than we deserved." We stood in that courthouse hallway, and for the first time in months there was no anger, no accusations. Just a family facing the truth of what they'd lost and what they'd done. That was 6 months ago. Michael and I still live in the house Ruth left us. We've kept it mostly the same because it feels like keeping Ruth's memory alive. Her garden still blooms every spring because I maintain it the way she taught me. Her favorite chair is still in the living room, even though seeing it empty sometimes makes me cry. Thomas, Catherine, and David each received their $10,000 from Ruth's estate. They didn't fight it or demand more. Catherine used hers to make a donation to a Parkinson's Research Foundation in Ruth's name. Thomas started a scholarship fund at the local community college for non-traditional students, something Ruth had always talked about wanting to do. David paid off some debt and told Michael he was trying to be more present with his own aging parents-in-law, learning from his mistakes. They don't visit often, but they do visit sometimes. Catherine came for Thanksgiving, and we went through old photo albums together, sharing memories of Ruth. Thomas calls every few weeks, short conversations but regular ones, staying in touch with Michael in a way he never did before. David stops by occasionally when he's in town, and he actually stays for more than an hour now, sitting in the kitchen talking about his daughters and his practice and life. The family isn't healed, not completely. Some things can't be undone, but there's a tentative peace built on honesty and Ruth's final act of truth-telling. She gave her children a gift with those videos, even though they experienced them as punishment. She gave them the truth they needed to hear, delivered with the love only a mother can have. The kind of love that tells hard truths because growing is more important than comfort. I think about Ruth every day. I talk to her sometimes, sitting in her garden or in her chair, telling her about our lives, about how Michael got a promotion at work, about the funny things that happen at the school, about how much we miss her. I tell her thank you for trusting us, for giving us a home, for seeing us when her own children couldn't see her. This real-life story taught me something important about family and inheritance. It's not really about the house or the money or the things we leave behind. It's about presence, about showing up when it's hard, about loving people in their decline as much as you loved them in their strength. Ruth gave us the house because we gave her our time, our care, our presence. We earned it not through manipulation, but through simple daily acts of love. And she gave her other children one final gift, the truth. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property. Sometimes it's a mirror held up with love, showing us who we've become and challenging us to be better. I hope they heard her. I hope they learned. And I hope that when my time comes, I'm half as wise and brave as Ruth was, creating a legacy not just of things, but of truth. If you've experienced family drama over inheritance, if you've been the one who showed up when others didn't, or if you've had to face hard truths about your own failures, please share your story in the comments. And if this emotional story resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more real-life stories about family, love, and the complicated truths we inherit from those we lose. Thank you for listening,